webinar. This is co-convened with Second Nature, sponsor of the American College and University President's Climate Commitment. And the topic of discussion today is third-party financing of solar on college and university campuses. Today, you're going to hear a little bit from me, but my job is to mostly cue this up and then get out of the way of these next two gentlemen. Ben Foster is a Senior Vice President at Optony Incorporated in California. Ben is as good an expert as I know on talking about the issues and opportunities and best practices of doing solar PV. Full disclosure, Ben has been a subcontractor to the GPP team for the last year and a half, 2 years. In fact, because of his expertise, and he's been tremendously helpful on a project that we're working on in Washington, D.C. Ben's going to lay out some best practices and some views of experience from the field, some things that you'll want to watch out for, think through, keep in mind. We're also going to hear from Chris O'Brien, who I suspect is known to almost everyone on the call. Chris is the Director of Sustainability at American University, and when I talk to stakeholders about the possibilities for green power in U.S. higher education, I talk about American a lot. They have been tremendously successful on a number of different fronts, have tried some things, have worked through some things, have implemented a number of solutions, continue to be insightful, thoughtful participants and stakeholders, and in fact, industry experts. And so having Ben and Chris together here today is as it's as good a combination of solar implementation in higher ed expertise as you're going to find anywhere. So as I say, this is co-convened with Second Nature, and EPA and Second Nature are working very closely on some activity here, starting at the end of 2012 and continuing on into 2013. We have some shared interests focused around climate neutrality and accelerating the pace of clean energy adoption across higher ed. We actually had a kickoff webcast just a couple weeks ago. It's archived on YouTube. It's a State of Renewables in Higher Education, where we present some assessments of the current state of the market, talk about some issues and opportunities and barriers, and hopefully get our respective organizations and our partnership and our stakeholders queued up to do great things. Serving as a convener and facilitator, I mean, the thing that's so striking here, right? And I'm actually jumping slides as I often do. Higher education as a group is uniquely positioned in the U.S. economy to change the face of the U.S. electricity portfolio. You all can do it, and you're starting to do it, and the opportunities here for higher ed, both to serve a transformative role and sort of a civil society role of leadership and tip of the spear and you know, let's go get this, tremendous. Right? There's also a set of critical and compelling benefits available to higher ed as participants in these markets. And we want to help unlock more of that better, faster, more easily for all of you. And that's a large part of what's driving this collaboration. Whether it's discussion about preferred procurement strategies, facilitating procurements by individual schools or groups of schools, and we'll wind up talking about that more than once, helping to bridge schools and their end-use demands with supply opportunities, highlighting best practices, developing the procurement documents, reviewing the procurement documents that get this done. We see a lot of work to be done and hopefully a lot of value that can be added to then, as I say, help you all unlock the economic and environmental value that is there to be had. And we in fact view this as a partnership and as a two-way two-way dynamic. And so we have some things that we would like to ask of all of you on the phone and all of your peer institutions that are not on the phone today. And we'd like to get them on the phone. We need to know on an ongoing basis what the barriers are that you encounter and continue to encounter as you look at the green power industry and opportunities. We need you to share your lessons learned and best practices with your peers. I mean, one of the interesting things about higher ed, there are a lot of you, and your organizations share a lot of similarities such that lessons learned, positive and negative, are highly replicable. And one of the things that we would like to help do is get that information out and make it transactional. And we are happy to provide as many platforms for you to do that via webinar or conference calls or papers, or propose something else to us, right? I mean, we want to do this, but we will amplify as many lessons learned as you can deliver to us. Buying groups. We have seen buying groups, and these can be structured in a variety of different ways, from very, very simple to fairly elaborate. We see these as transformative, and we would like some volunteers. We can talk about this going forward. We know some schools have participated in buying groups before. We know that the architecture works. We know that having a peer group can absolutely change the equation. And so we will help organize them, but we need some folks to say, yes, we'd like to either participate, or especially, we'd be willing to lead, or at least consider leading. And EPA, let's have a conversation about that. We'd also like to invite you to share with us your RFIs or RFPs or PPAs, the documents that you found that have been effective, or even the ones that have not been effective, right? I mean, if someone has an example of an RFP that was an absolute disaster and is willing to share it and share why it was a disaster, that can be a tremendously helpful lesson to the rest of the market. So that's where we're headed. And the discussion today is around green power. This is electricity, right, from all these pretty technologies. There are three basic procurement options or product configurations. The focus today is on on-site generation. I will note that looking across our landscape of higher education green power partners, RECs are far and away the dominant transactional instrument, which is not surprising, right? They because of the flexibility and some of the other characteristics of the instrument, the fact they are a utility scale instrument. And I will also tell you that if additionality and creating new generation is the driver, and frankly, if doing that while accessing environmental benefits is part of the desired outcome, all three of these products can be accessed in ways that deliver those benefits. The value proposition for renewables, I'm going to whip past this fairly quickly, noting as we go past it, the value proposition is considerable, it is flexible, it is a different equation for different campuses and even for different silos within a given campus. But there's something here for everyone. There's something here for the student body. There's something here for the admissions office as a recruiting tool. There is something here for the CFO. There's something here for whoever in the organization is charged with risk mitigation and brand management, and there's something here for the environmental silo. The key here, and we actually had someone make this point, a solar developer make this point explicitly in a webinar last month. Given some of the volatility in the rest of the market, the uncertainty around the production tax credit, the continuing slow pace of evolution on national policy, the supply side of the market is extraordinarily interested in doing deals, doing projects with large energy users, with certain operational characteristics, long-term organizational stability, and dynamite credit ratings, financial stability. That's you. You all have that. You all have that more than any other single class of enterprise in the American economy. And you are to be found in every single geographic market of the American economy. You all can do this. You all have a very, very special value in the equation of bringing new renewables to the U.S. Generation portfolio. It's an important thing. Barriers, and let's especially sort of start to focus our attention on the on-site barriers, right? Upfront capital costs. Do I have to spend $200,000 to buy a whole bunch of solar hardware up front? The answer is no, and Ben and Chris can talk about that in more detail. Transaction costs. What are they? How do I structure them? You know what? I'm a university. How do I design, spec, procure, install, operate, maintain, and depreciate solar? That's not what we do. How do I deal with that? What are my system performance risks? How does all this get dealt with? And that, in fact, is the panel that we have for you today, is addressing all of those questions, all of those barriers. We have additional sessions planned, and we are constantly open to shaping this ongoing dialogue in ways that reflect your interest, your experience, your barriers, and your needs. So please let us know. This is what we have coming up. The purchasing groups, a lot of potential to be transformative. Utility scale wind PPAs. There are several schools that have actually had success recently in doing this, and my observation across this set of stakeholders, and particularly across schools that are looking at climate neutrality, is that you are very likely to explore both on-site and utility scale solutions. And so we're going to focus our attention and our efforts to bring you information and transactional solutions on both those fronts. So this is what's coming up. Stay tuned. We have a whole set of links here where you can find out more about the program. My contact information is there. Anthony Amato's contact information is there. Anthony's with ERG. He's our lead support contractor and probably known to most of you on the session today because he's one of our main higher ed guys. So that's my introduction, and thank you for bearing with me. And now let's get Ben Foster from Optony up on the screen, and let's give Ben control. And Ben, let's benefit from your knowledge and experience.
Great, thanks very much, Blaine. I appreciate it. Hopefully everyone can see my screen. Is that correct, Blaine?
I believe it's
yes. Okay, excellent. Very good. Thank you. And so I appreciate the intro. It's really exciting to have this opportunity for us to share a lot of the lessons learned that we see on the ground, and at least to get that discussion started, and also provide a framework, because we found that for power purchase agreements or for other types of solar projects, that even having a framework to understand what to look for, what not to look for, what are some of the key decision-making criteria, these are all things that matter to you and that we want to share. Now, we could, in a broader discussion, talk more in detail about the benefits of solar from an economic, environmental perspective, education, leadership, the slide that Blaine had just showed as well, but we'll focus on the specific area today of third-party financing. And one quick note about Optony and what we do, just so you know who's talking. We represent buyers and investors, primarily government agencies, local, state, federal, commercial entities, and of course schools, colleges, and universities. We do not represent or have any financial interest in the developers, PPA providers, or sellers. So our experience will provide you some of the rough around the edges things that can happen from a buyer's perspective, from your perspective, and some of the work and all that are in these things, but also some of the success stories that we have. So on the agenda, we'll talk a bit about why solar financing matters, a comparison against direct purchase versus PPA, just as a couple of examples of all the ones that exist, and then some more details. And we'll try not to get too boring on the details, but give you the framework for how to understand those. With that, then the first step that we wanted to discuss is that financing impacts more than just the cost of the system. It changes the performance and some of the project risks not only upfront costs, but the long-term returns are different based on the financing that you use, whether it's a direct purchase, a power purchase agreement, which is the prevalent part of the industry right now from third-party financing. Power purchase agreements represent about 70% of the types of financing that are being used right now across the country, whether that's in East Coast, New Jersey, Massachusetts, out to the West Coast in California and Arizona. It's consistently in the 60 to 80% range. So we're going to focus on that one because it's a very common method that many of you have probably heard about. But there are others as well. Equipment leasing, bond financing, which may be not directly applicable to many of the universities that are private but public sector, schools and others. Enhanced use leases, utility financing, energy service contracts. These are a number of different structures, but by far and away the first two are the most common, with power purchase agreements being closer to that 70% range. So each one of those changes not only the performance risk and the upfront cost and the way that your returns look, both short-term and long-term, but even the procurement process. How do you evaluate and find the right solution when you're doing a direct purchase contract for construction versus a power purchase agreement? The system design and the sizing, as well as the project benefits to the owner versus the power purchase agreement provider, and O&M, operations and maintenance, and long-term risk and cost change as well. So it's important when you're looking at these is to, when you're considering a power purchase agreement, is not to necessarily treat it the same way you would as a direct purchase, or if there are other financing structures you're looking at, to look at the entire project portfolio or the entire project set of assumptions and risks and whatnot when you're doing this. So we'll just that's an overall statement around the fact that financing isn't just about the dollars and cents on the individual economic returns, but also on the overall project specifically. So on the direct purchase, just a quick note on this one. This is the model that most of you would be familiar with. You build new buildings on campus constantly. You make upgrades. This is an ownership model that you would be familiar with, of course, that you would own, operate, maintain the system. You have full responsibility then for the performance long term, although there are maintenance contracts and performance guarantees that can either be included or purchased. The capital cost, of course, the full cost of the system is due at delivery and may be partially offset, though, by rebates and incentives, whether it's for higher ed, nonprofits, governments, et cetera. So there are some offsets that are available. In the nonprofit or higher ed sector, that many of the tax benefits and incentives that are focused on whether it's investment tax credit or accelerated depreciation would not be available to you, and that's where a third-party owned system tends to be more popular as well, because those, and we'll talk about that in a minute, can take advantage of the tax credit. And of course, you could finance that whether internally or potentially through a loan or lease structure as well. The financial benefits for a direct purchase is that the savings start immediately. So once you've paid for the system, all of the energy that's produced and the offset to your facility usage would immediately go to your bottom line from an operational savings perspective. And we see that in some areas where there's a capital budget and separated from the operational budget, that then the capital budget use of funds is very efficient to spend on projects that have a high return on the long-term operational costs, so that by investing money up front out of the capital budget, you see immediate cost savings to an operational line item that then can be used for other things, and for other purchases, other operations, other maintenance, educational costs, et cetera, that are going into the facility. Also on a direct purchase, that owner of the system has all the related energy credits, the solar renewable energy credits and others, that they can then turn around and either sell and monetize, or they could keep and use that to offset and meet certain sustainability and GHG reduction goals. And they tend, solar systems, as opposed to some others, wind and the rest, because they don't really have any moving parts, that they have very low operating costs. There are certainly some cleaning, inspection services that are required on a normal basis, and the inverters do have to be maintained and replaced on occasion, but the reality is that it has very low operating costs, much lower than many other technologies that are out there. And here's the quick slide on the cash flow example. We just like to provide this to give, in comparison to a power purchase agreement, you'll see on the left there's the initial investment, which is the cash out of pocket. And then over time, what happens then is you see the savings from a utility perspective because your system is directly connected to your facility. You can net metering benefits of reduction in your net energy usage and what you have to pay for your prevailing utility. There may be rebates, and this is a particular example from California, with the California Solar Initiative rebates, but other states, other localities have rebates. And then the value of the solar renewable energy credit if it's sold or if it's kept. So we break that into some different horizons where there's a rebate schedule, there's utility savings ongoing. At some point there's an inverter replacement, and then usually from a budget perspective, that's about in year 15 or so, or 16. And then during the entire period, there's generally an O&M cost associated with it. So the net of that is an immediate savings that grows over time. And as opposed to a power purchase agreement, at a high level, there's a third party that owns and operates and maintains that system. It's generally an LLC structure that has owners and has investors in it, and that usually is a project developer and a finance partner. And then that PPA, because it's a commercial entity, receives all the federal, state, local incentives, as well as any tax benefits and rebates that are available. The system output then, its production capacity is the direct responsibility of that PPA provider. But generally under these agreements, the customer is responsible for purchasing all power. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means from a contractual perspective. The capital costs, there are no upfront capital costs for the buyer, so that curve, and we'll show a chart here in a second, that it looks quite different because there's no upfront capital cost. But there is additional legal work, and so depending on your internal legal review structure and from the back and forth and negotiation that happens, the legal services can be expensive, and that's one thing to be aware of. On the financial benefit side, you know now what the fixed, with a PPA, what the fixed price per kilowatt hour is up front, and you know exactly what that cost will be over usually a 20-year period of the power purchase agreement. That escalation rate is also added in on an annual basis. That may be increased by somewhere between 1% to 4% per year. Those are all negotiable terms. And the key here is that unlike your utility prices where you don't have any knowledge or contractual relationship with them over the long term, with a power purchase agreement you do. So many buyers look at this as a way to hedge their risk for utility prices as well looking forward. The savings in the early years are generally low just because of the investment that's required on the part of the PPA provider and the costs that are charged, although incentive structures and SREC valuations in certain markets like New Jersey and others where there's a very large inherent subsidy in the SREC value that's assigned or that is bought and sold, or was at least a couple of years ago, the savings can actually be very significant in the early years as well. And then who owns the SREC, so the solar renewable energy credit, is negotiable as well in markets where we see that the value tends to be low from a traded perspective. Then it's fairly easy for the customer to own those at a very low cost. But of course, in a higher priced market for SRECs, again on the East Coast, there are many of those. Then that'll have a value where the customer will tend to give up a fixed price that may be very beneficial to own the SREC. And so in this case, though, also the sizing of the system must be closely evaluated, and performance guarantees you want to look for so that in the event, let's say you're expecting to save a certain amount per kilowatt hour every year, and the system underperforms, then of course you don't see that saving. And so although you don't have to pay for the energy that wasn't produced, you also don't see the savings that you expected. So there are things that's important to look at, both from a system sizing perspective, over or undersized, and then performance guarantees. But one of the questions that we get a lot is, what's the ROI? Well, a return on investment, or ROI, requires an investment. And with a power purchase agreement, there is no investment. So you could say it's immediate in that sense in many cases. Or what we tend to do is look at it as the net present value and compare that net present value of a power purchase agreement against other options. And at the end of the term, generally, and we'll talk about this in a minute, there are a number of different options. One would be that the customer can purchase the system. And here's a quick example of the cash flow from a power purchase agreement where it's the utility savings minus the PPA cost is the net. So if you were to compare those two charts, the actual dollar amount saved on an annual basis are lower here with a PPA than they were with a direct purchase, but there's no initial investment. So you're in the money, so to speak, or a cash payback period in year one. Now, let's talk a little bit about the contracting itself. So those were high level how you might compare and consider the differences between a direct purchase versus a power purchase agreement. But let's look a little bit deeper into what is actually the nuts and bolts of the power purchase agreement. So this is a legal contract between the host or the buyer, you might say, and a PPA, which is generally structured as a limited liability company, which has investors, owners, developers, vendors, installers, insurance providers, and whatnot behind it, so that you don't have to undertake all that as you might if you were doing the direct development. So they handle all that on the back end, but it's important to note that there are other parties within the PPA structure. So that you as a buyer or a host. Yes, go ahead.
I'm sorry, it's Blaine. We're getting a little bit of fading in and out on your voice. I wonder if you can speak a little more directly into the receiver. Is that possible?
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Blaine. Will do. I'll speak up more. Thanks for that. So with a PPA, there's also important to note that there's not just one contract. I mean, ultimately it is one large contract, but there are a number of documents that are related to it. So there's a master agreement itself between the buyer and the PPA provider. There's also documents that specify generally what's the price and escalation factors over the duration, the system specifications that they will install on your system, termination and buyout schedules, monitoring O&M protocols, and you can read through the list here. What's key to note on the documents is that you'd want to get these out front as soon as possible, because they can, from a negotiation perspective, they can change. Or if you assume, for instance, that you have gold-plated system specifications in your discussions with them and the pricing looks really good, and then but the system specifications are not actually included in the contract, then when it comes time to construction, of course, they could install something different than what you expected, and anything that is a change from what they were planning to install then becomes a change order and then becomes a negotiation. So we counsel from the buy side to make sure that all these documents are included as quickly as possible in that negotiation, so that later on during the construction period, when you think everything's done, there's not a lot of revisiting of contract terms, conditions, specifications, et cetera. From a contract term and termination perspective, so now diving into a little bit more details about some of the major sections that would be within a power purchase agreement. The term and buyout of these contracts is they tend to be a 20-year contract starting on a commercial operations date. There is generally a discussion or a specification or a requirement for the construction to start and end at a certain date as well, so that you know what to expect from a planning perspective on the construction start date, from a savings perspective in terms of when it's put online, and that there are no unexpected delays in terms of this process getting both started and completed. There's generally a buyout potential starting anywhere as early as year 6, and that's because anything prior to that gets mixed up in the tax-related benefits and incentives and rebates that they can qualify for as a commercial PPA developer. So where there's investment tax credit and accelerated depreciation that generally works through the system, and any reachback-related requirements from the IRS for about 5 or 6 years. So generally there's not a buyout option prior to that, just because it would make the transaction very complex, but we'll talk in a minute about early termination. And then periodically thereafter. So we see everything from annual buyout options, which could be excessive in terms of the need to do that. You're probably not going to revisit that decision every year, or more likely periodically. So maybe at year 6, at year 10, year 15, and then of course at the end there's a buyout option. At generally it's fair market value. It could be or some other number, whichever is higher. That is generally an IRS requirement from a commercial perspective, that there's not a set price, so it doesn't look too much like a direct purchase option, because then that would change the tax nature, tax treatment of these systems and the contracts. At the end of the term, there's also an option generally that you could extend it, maybe in 5-year periods. It's not uncommon to extend the term as it stands at that point. Or you could just say, we're done, this is great, we want to look for additional options, or maybe the facility that the solar system is at, you have some plans to renovate or upgrade or update it, and you want to postpone any additional use of solar at that facility for a little while, and in which case then, if you don't purchase it, then the PPA provider is responsible to remove all equipment, and the site is restored to its original, or at least its normal wear and tear condition. There's also an option for early termination that can be handled in a number of different ways. As a local government perspective, this is a particularly contentious issue at times where they have an annual budget appropriation cycle, and so they don't really know in the future, from a pure legal perspective, whether they'll be able to continue to pay for their energy costs at a given facility. So this is something that is unlikely to occur, but it could occur, and so there's generally a schedule in here of early termination, so that for whatever reason, if you chose to terminate it starting immediately in year one, that you could do so. Now, the challenge really is with that is that in the first 6 years, because of that tax treatment of it, the costs are really prohibitive, and so it's highly unlikely from an economic perspective you'd want to do it, but from a legal perspective you could. And then after that, it's negotiable in terms of how that's treated, but in many cases it's treated as fair market value plus removal costs of the system. In terms of pricing and payments, on this particular topic, there's generally a set price per kilowatt hour, and then, however, the buyer must purchase all of the kilowatt hours produced. So if they produce 1 kilowatt hour a year or 1 million a year, then you have to purchase everything that's produced. And that billing is based on the calculation, a very simple calculation. It's the fixed rate times the electricity generated. And those payments are due on a monthly basis, meaning that they'll be higher in the summer because that's when the energy is produced, and lower in the winter when not as much energy is produced. And so what we'll see then is on an annual basis an escalation rate of 1 to 4%, so that once a year there would be an adjustment that would be part of your contract, negotiated and written into the contract. So that on an annual basis that would increase. So if it starts at 10 cents and then the next year it would be 11 cents, the next year 12 cents, and so on and so forth. And so what you'd want to do on this particular area is make sure that clearly not only what the PPA price is, but what are the assumptions that you're making about your prevailing utility price. So we see some of the buyers that want to have a very low escalation rate, but they may pay a little bit more per kilowatt hour up front, and some will take a higher escalation rate and then look for a lower cost per kilowatt hour up front. And so that is sort of a seesaw. On one side is the price, and the other side is the escalation rate. So as the escalation rate goes up, the initial cost per kilowatt hour can go down, and vice versa. Now, in terms of renewable energy credits, the buyer can either own those RECs or not at the inception of the PPA. It's a negotiable item. Depends on what you believe the value is and how important they are to you to own, as well as the PPA, what's in the back of that arrangement that they have with their financiers and the project developer and other folks that are part of that transaction, what they believe that SREC value is, both currently and in the future. So although you maintaining the SRECs will add to your PPA cost, because you have them, you can either hold them or sell them or engage in some sort of a hybrid solution. So you may choose to sell the first 5 years because that's a known quantity that has some value to the PPA provider. Generally with the markets right now, anything beyond that, even beyond 3 years, is heavily discounted. So there's some advantage to you maybe selling the first few years and then owning them for a longer period of time. It depends on your market. There's also some SREC arbitrage that can happen where you may sell it in a higher value market, let's say New Jersey or Maryland maybe, and then purchase lower cost RECs from outside of that area. So there's still a net addition to clean power in the region, but from a purely economic perspective, you can benefit as much as possible from that difference in markets between the SREC pricing. In terms of performance and warranties, and I know this text is a bit heavy here, so and I believe it'll all be posted online, so you can refer to it and follow up. I'm happy to continue to answer questions. On the performance and warranty side, the system performance is based on a forecasted annual output, and that is a number that would be in your contract generally, so you'd want to make sure to know what exactly the annual output is expected to be on the system. That would then be adjusted for any weather conditions or force majeure activities. If there's a hurricane or an earthquake or something else that might take the system offline. And if the system underperforms, as mentioned before, you only pay, they only bill you for, and you only pay for the energy that was delivered. Now, that may impact your savings. So if you're saving 5 cents per kilowatt hour on the PPA rate versus your prevailing utility, and they only produce half as much, then clearly you may be in the position where you're not saving as much either. If the system overperforms, on the other side, is generally you're not required to, if this is part of your contract, to purchase all of the power above some percent, maybe above 110% of the planned performance, but you can if it's beneficial. So that way, if for some reason the system produces more than you even consume on the facility, you can refuse anything over a certain percentage. We also generally recommend that if there's underperformance below a certain percentage, and this would be maybe below 50% or 25% of a full year, that could be considered a default. So that, for instance, let's say the system just has some pervasive issues over time, and the system's not performing at all, that you have some remedies that you can pursue. Also, there are warranties on equipment, on the workmanship, on the inverter, on the balance of system-related items. These are all things that should last or should be contracted through the lifetime of the PPA. And, of course, they're responsible if there are any failures to promptly fix them and to make sure that the system's performing as they expected, because if it's not working as expected, then they're not able to bill you for the output, of course. And another thing that's important with warranties, sometimes we get questions about, well, who cares if it's warranted or not? Because at the end of the system, if you have the option of buying it or even during the lifetime of the system, and the warranties aren't in place and they're not transferable to you, the buyer, then you're taking on some additional risk that you may not have priced into it. On the system design side, you'd want to make sure that from a system design perspective that they are following the industry best practices and the sizing of the system is appropriate for your usage on facility. You'd also want to take a look at that the construction itself conforms to any jurisdictional requirements and that they will go through the official permitting process so that you make sure that it's safe, as well as meeting the industry requirements and best practices within your jurisdiction so there aren't issues later on. You'd also, in many cases, especially on a college campus or a school where there's a really strong construction cycle in the summertime, is that they plan around that generally so that they're also working at a time when it has minimum impact on that particular facility or site, especially in parking lots and other areas. And it's important here, again, because you want to make sure that the system output is what the basis of your payments to that PPA provider are. And, of course, at some point, if you buy it out, you want to make sure that the equipment and the system itself is one that meets or exceeds industry best practices. Other terms and conditions related to this, I want to be sensitive to time here. Insurance, you'd want to make sure that they are fully insured during construction and that they have general liability and any other standard coverages over the full period of the contract. Force majeure, understanding what's included in there and what's not. For instance, utility interruption and curtailment requests may or may not be included. Equipment failure or system underperformance is generally something you'd want to be not included in force majeure. So, for instance, if the system fails out of no fault of your own or other external factors, maybe just because an inverter, there's a pervasive inverter issue or something, that's not something that the PPA provider can escape from. And of course, there are other terms within the contracts that exist where the PPA provider can sell that actual agreement to others, and then under what condition and how you handle defaults and disputes. So there's a number of other terms and conditions to look at as well. So with that, those are the major sections that you would find in a PPA and how you would approach them. So how do you make the call and how do you evaluate the contract? There's just a little bit more information here we wanted to share at this point, which is how do you evaluate the PPA responses? So let's say, as Blaine was mentioning, you set out a best practice RFI, RFP for proposals. They come back, well, what are you really evaluating here? And one of the things is that if a power purchase agreement is an agreement to buy power from an entity that is like your current utility. So what are the provider capabilities? What's the pricing? What's the production estimates that they have? Those are the things that are most important, although there are other considerations as well and things to negotiate in the contract. You want to compare it to what are you currently paying, who's the utility provider, what's the pricing options that you have, are there other rate schedules that may get you the best possible rate of return. Your SREC values and the market itself is something to understand and understand whether it's better to keep them or to sell them or what the relative value is. The technical details are interesting because different vendors, and this is one thing that we get a lot of questions are, what if we should we specify the exact technology that they should use and the exact financing? And for the best-in-class providers out there right now on the PPA side, they've figured out largely who the providers are that they can work with in a cost-effective way and with a high quality and reliable product and service, and who they should avoid. And so if you overly specify like technology X with financier Y and installer Z, then you will potentially run into issues because those three haven't worked before, and so you may actually increase your risk. And what you're really looking for is experience managing similar projects to make sure that they can get it done. And then the last few areas we'll talk about in this. Okay, so the last few areas here are related to basically verifying the production forecast and the cost savings over time. One of the things that we tend to find as well is that the numbers may look good, but unless you actually standardize the analysis over a 20-year period from different providers, basically standardizing across escalation, assumptions, utility rate increases, what your expected usage on your facilities are in terms of total energy versus the offset, and what are some of the operations and maintenance costs, and the discount rate and the SREC valuation. Unless you standardize all those in a consistent way, then you may be led to believe that a certain vendor has all the right characteristics, but the cost may be higher than a different vendor that has similar capabilities. So verifying the information that's provided and then standardizing that and considering all the different assumptions that the vendors have included in their proposals are important. One of the things that, again, from a best practice perspective, is that if you define what they should use in each one of these areas, then what comes back is easier to analyze. So you have really two options. You can specify and say for each of these areas use this particular value for escalation, this value for utility rate increases, and this value for facility usage, and so on and so forth. And then when the proposals come back, they're already largely applicable and to one another, and it's an apples-to-apples comparison. Some folks will just ask for whatever the vendor wants to provide, in which case then it is a little bit more challenging to line those up because then you have to do more work on the back end with the proposals that come in to basically reanalyze them based on a standardized set of assumptions. So that's an important thing on the front end that you can do to make your life much easier on the back end. And then the final piece here is challenges and opportunities. So some of the challenges that we see are the financial stability on the seller side, making sure that you have a financially stable seller and investor. This is not so much a big issue, not such a big issue now as it was back in 2009, 2010, 2008, when the whole credit crunch happened and a lot of folks dropped out. The credit risk on the buyer side, Blaine mentioned this, that sometimes as a buyer you may have a higher or lower credit rating than others, in which case then that can cause some issues. That's generally not a problem in the higher education sector, though. A subtle one here is the next couple of points, which is there can be over-negotiation. Sometimes that misperception of risk that as a buyer you might think, well, what if this happens? What if this particular situation happens? I want no risk under that situation. Well, that's going to increase the price of your PPA potentially and end up driving your costs up and not really mitigating your risk over time. There may be more effective ways to do that. And we also find, just as a heads up, that sometimes there is a revisiting of the contract terms even after negotiation. On the back end of that power purchase agreement, there are investors and other financial partners and insurance partners that may not be fully engaged until after a contract is signed, in which case then they take a look at it and they say, well, we see what you signed, but we're not willing to finance it unless you make these couple of tweaks to a contract. That can delay the time frame. It can drive up the legal costs as well on your end, because you have to then go through another round of review and negotiation. So it is one thing to to watch out for, and one of the ways to avoid that on the front end is to get an understanding from the PPA providers that you're negotiating with what level of involvement they have already had with their financiers or the insurance providers. So that's generally where the revisiting of those contract terms will be driven from. On the opportunity side, there's in a number of different markets, there are alternative rate schedules from a utility that may provide additional cost savings. There's also, of course, you want to consider energy efficiency measures. We do find, because solar has a certain cachet to it, it's very popular right now in many areas, that it can help to open up a broader discussion to other energy efficiency measures or even other energy renewable energy options on that particular facility. So you can always use solar PPA as a way to open up the discussion to other measures that may be available in other utility rate schedules that can help you save even more money. And then to move on to the topics of collaborative efforts, we have found very consistently that there's a significant savings on the transaction time, the conservation of funds from a legal perspective, from a transaction perspective, staff time perspective, and also a market increase in bargaining power on the part of a collective group that comes together to go through this process. They can go faster and they can end up with a better result. And that's partly because of the standardization of the process and even standardization of power purchase agreement terms, and partially due just to the volume. And of course, other opportunities that exist are not only environmental benefits and curricular integration, but then also leadership and community education, which wraps back to the points that Blaine had brought up. So with that, I've completed the review of these different topic areas within the actual power purchase agreements. We're happy to answer questions. I think at this point we turn it back over to Chris O'Brien to continue the discussion.
Yeah, let's as we get Chris queued up. I missed part of my administrator duties here, and I think people have found the question panel on the webinar control pane. There is a question window. It is open. We've got questions coming in and queued up for that portion of the session today. If you haven't found that, please, and have questions on your mind, please go ahead and shoot some stuff in as we're moving along. With Chris and Ben's permission, we will extend the session today till 4:15 or so to provide as much opportunity as possible for people to get their questions answered. And with that, Chris, it is all yours.
Thanks, Blaine. Is my screen showing okay?
Yes, it is.
Okay, great. Well, my name is Chris O'Brien. I'm the Director of Sustainability at American University. We're about 12,000 students here in the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. And Blaine told you why you should do solar. Ben told you how to do it through a PPA. And I'm basically going to tell you that we did do it, and they're right. So I'm going to actually keep this pretty brief and just tell you what we did so we can get into the questions. First of all, probably like many of you, our interest in solar was driven by our commitment to our signature to the American College and University President's Climate Commitment. We published a climate plan that calls for achieving carbon neutrality by 2020. And the slide you see now is one of the arrays that's part of our solar PV PPA on top of our library. And that's our small but powerful force of sustainability staff in our Office of Sustainability. And by the way, you know, one of the things I'll repeat a couple times is that solar is real in terms of its benefits to climate, but it also has a lot of curb appeal, and that's one of the benefits of solar that I think really helps a lot of sustainability programs that choose to go with solar, is that it tells the story of sustainability in a way that really almost nothing else does quite as well as seeing solar panels. So we make a lot of good use of the visuals of our solar installations. Speaking of which, we've actually done a couple different types of solar installations. I'm only going to talk about the solar PV array, PPA, but we've also done some direct purchase of solar PV and solar hot water. We also did a large solar hot water PPA. What you're seeing on this screen was our first foray into solar PV, and it was actually a direct purchase. on our School of International Service. But going back to our climate plan calls for using 4 strategies to get to carbon neutrality. First is to reduce emissions at the source through reducing our consumption of things that produce emissions. Secondly is to produce renewable energy on campus. Third is to source the rest of our energy from renewable sources off campus. And fourth and finally is to offset the remaining unavoidable emissions. So where we're talking about today is number 2 there, the production of renewable energy on site on our campus. And again, we're in Washington, D.C., not a particularly sunny locale. We get decent sun, but we're not like the Southwest. So one of the lessons that I would want to underscore today is that even up in the Mid-Atlantic and in the Northeast, it's possible to do solar and make it financially feasible. So given the strategies in our climate plan, we've actually made a lot of progress already in terms of, and I want to mention this because doing solar is only part of the picture, and I want to make sure people get the context in which we did solar, which is that we're also dramatically setting very dramatic energy consumption reduction goals, starting out by building energy audits, metering all of our energy sources at the building level, and setting out to dramatically reduce our energy consumption. And when you get a sense of the scale of solar on our campus and how much energy it produces relative to how much we consume, you can see why we really need to focus on energy efficiency in addition to energy production. We do lots of building occupant engagement activities, including energy competitions, both from building to building as well as campus to other, competing from one campus to other campuses. We do source all of our electricity via wind renewable energy credits, so we're actually currently 100% green powered, and part of that is through our solar installations. But I want to, I'll remind you of some of the nuances that Ben mentioned in terms of retaining renewable energy credits from solar installations that complicate the message a little bit about the quote green power from our on-site installations. So very simply, our solar PV project is a PPA. The owner of the PPA is Washington Gas, which is a utility in our area. We have a deregulated energy market, so there's a competitive marketplace in Washington, D.C. for solar PPAs. One of the competitors is Washington Gas. One of the biggest installers in our region is called Standard Solar. They've been around a long time, and we had previously worked with them. So that was our installer. The capacity was just over 0.5 megawatt. That's spread over 6 buildings with estimated production of about 800,000 kilowatt hours a year, and that degrades a little bit over time, but that was the year 1 estimate. The value of this is about $4.5 million. That's the energy plus the value of the SRECs. We're in a very high-value SREC market in Washington, D.C. because we have a solar carve-out in our renewable portfolio standard, which is a really great mechanism for financing solar. In short, part of what has made this possible in Washington, D.C. and on our campus is the fact that we have good policy backed up with what is now a competitive marketplace. So that policy of having a renewable portfolio standard, which I think 30-some states now have, and in particular having a portion of the renewables that are required to be sold in the District of Columbia, a portion of that has to come from solar. So that's where the solar renewable energy credit derives its value in Washington, D.C., and that is about half of the value of this project. Because of that, we chose not to retain ownership of the SRECs. And I'll get into that more in a minute. In terms of the equipment, we used a racking system from a company called Sunlink. It's a ballasted mounting system, which means there are no roof penetrations or very minimal roof penetrations. At least the panels themselves do not penetrate the roof, which means, in terms of reducing any risk of leaks in roofs. We've done a lot to avoid that by reducing the need for any penetrations, and it also makes it a whole lot easier to move things if and when you ever need to move things to get at. If you need to put something else on the roof and move some of the panels, that's very feasible. We used inverters from a company called PV Powered. Each building has a 75 kW or 100 kW inverter. The panels are from Trina. We have 2,150 panels, which, it's one of the numbers that people ask us all the time is how many panels you have. It's really kind of a, it's not a meaningless number, but, more importantly is how much energy it produces. But for what it's worth, that's how many panels we have. I just noted there as well that they do have basically a lifetime warranty, 25 years. Again, they're spread out over 6 different buildings. Each building has its own inverter and meter, and we flipped the switch on this summer of last year. So how did we go about developing this project? We had already worked with Standard Solar, who installed the solar PV on our first green building on campus, our first LEED Gold certified building. We wanted to include solar on that from the get-go, so we did, and that was a direct purchase system. In other words, not financed by a PPA, but we paid for it ourselves. And so since we had a good experience working with them, I just picked up the phone and called them and said, hey, can you just look at a Google map and tell me where you think we have potential on our campus for additional solar installations? The technology is so good now that it's relatively easy to get a pretty good sense of where you have solar potential just by looking online. Having the right people look online for you. And what some of the things they're looking for is just total square footage of unobstructed roof area and what the exposure is. And so, based on an initial conversation where they said, you basically have lots of built opportunity, maybe somewhere between 0.5 megawatt and 750 kW, we said, okay, let's take the next step. They basically did a preliminary design just because we asked. Then they actually brought the PPA financier to the table for us. They said, we've worked with Washington Gas in the past. Would you like to see a proposal from them? We said, sure. The initial proposal was competitive with the price that we pay for electricity now. So we said, well, we can spend a few $1 million to pay for solar PV, or we can let someone else pay for it and have competitively priced electricity on day one for no upfront cost, just like Ben said. And that's what we did. So we, literally on day one, we were saving dollars. Our PPA term is 20 years at a fixed price plus an annual escalator. And again, as Ben said, that if electricity prices go the way that we expect them to go, we get more value from this system over time because the escalator is less than what we expect electricity costs to actually escalate at. So we save money on day one, and we think we'll save more and more as we go. Importantly, because this is a PPA, we do not own the system. So that means Washington Gas, the owner of the PPA, they own the system, which means we don't touch it. Something goes wrong, either they know it already because they monitor it. They're monitoring. Actually, Standard Solar, their subcontractor and installer, is monitoring it. So if they see something go funny, they know that it's going funny because we're only paying for what we get. So Washington Gas has a high stake in making sure that the system is productive. If the system loses output, they'll know it, and they'll want to correct it because that's money that we're not paying them for electricity that's not being produced. So really, it's a very beneficial contract structure that puts the onus on the owner of the system to make sure that the system is producing as expected, because we're only going to pay for what it produces. And that means no maintenance for us. We only pay for what we get. We never touch the system. If it rains or snows or sleets or hails, doesn't matter to us. It's up to them to do anything to make sure that the system is operating optimally. I mentioned that we allowed them to retain ownership of the SRECs because they're so valuable in DC, and I'm talking about $300 per SREC or more. I think when we did this, they were at around $325 a piece. That's very valuable. That's not the same thing you're going to find in every location around the U.S. But in our case, because they're so valuable, that really helped underwrite the cost of this project. That's essentially what's driving the PPA owner to want to do this, because they happen to be a utility themselves or an energy marketer. So in other words, to market energy in DC, you have to be including a portion from solar. So for them to comply with that, they need people who have roofs, i.e. universities and others with big commercial buildings, to say, hey, you can use our roof. That lets them comply with their mandated portion of solar, and allows us to advance the installation of net additional clean renewable energy right here in the District of Columbia, not exactly known as a hotbed of solar, but it has now become one. When we looked at it and decided to go with the PPA, there are pros and cons to a direct purchase versus a PPA. They're the same things that Ben already outlined, and I'll just say that the main reason to go with a PPA is that you can't afford it otherwise, and the part of the reason you wouldn't be able to afford it otherwise is that a third-party private partner, PPA owner, is eligible for tax incentives that nonprofit universities are not eligible for. That's part of what makes it more financially attractive to allow someone else to do it. I hope that will increasingly be the case, that solar will be competitive just based on the price of energy. So as we move into coming years, my hope is that these tax benefits may be less central to undergirding the structure of financing solar, which would allow nonprofit entities like universities to find an attractive way to self-finance solar. And in fact, we are now looking at doing that with solar hot water, which even though we would miss some of the tax incentives, we are looking at direct purchase of solar hot water in our next round of solar hot water installations. But you can see on the screen here, and it is really just a repeat of what Ben said, there are pros and cons to direct purchases and to power purchase agreements. Essentially, the argument is they get a lot of tax benefits that we can't, and therefore it makes it more financially attractive to allow a third party to finance it. But if you have the money, you should do the cost analysis and determine what's the payback, and if that's a tolerable payback, then go with a direct purchase. PPA is there if needed, but I don't think it should be the default. Finally, I mentioned solar really has a lot of curb appeal, so we try to make a lot of use of telling the story of our solar. So we have a building energy dashboard from Lucid Design, and this is a screenshot of the solar production from one of our buildings, and we're now adding all of the other solar meters to this dashboard so that we can tell the story of the energy that's being produced on kiosks in lobbies around campus, so that you can walk into our library, for example, and be able to see that solar panels on the roof of this building are active right now and they're producing energy. It really helps connect the message to our population. And this is the final slide. This is another way that we're telling the story. Like every campus, we have thousands of visitors every year that come to campus to take tours, parents and prospective students who are coming to the campus. Our job in part is to persuade them to make the decision to apply to go to college at American University, and part of the way that we're doing that increasingly is by emphasizing our sustainability commitments. So we now have a sustainability map that we give to visitors, and as you can see on this map here, the little yellow sunburst icons indicate where we have solar panels on campus, and you can see there are a whole bunch of them, 7 of them now. So that really helps tell the story in a graphic and visual way that people understand just very intuitively. It really speaks to the message of sustainability. This is my contact information. You can email us at sustainability@american.edu, A lot of our sustainability info is on our website at american.edu/sustainability. We Twitter and Facebook constantly. Our hashtag for both is GreenAU, and I think it's now time for questions.
Chris, nice job. Ben, nice job. And Chris, I got to tell you, I love that campus map with the sustainability features. That's really slick. And I missed the chance to communicate this earlier, but you just provided me another one. EPA has been so consistently impressed by AU's green power activities that we gave them a Green Power Leadership Award last year, and it was well deserved. All right, so we have a lot of questions, which is terrific. I know that we are past the originally scheduled time, and I understand that people may run into other elements of their days. We will hang in as long as Ben and Chris are available, and folks want to stay on the line. We have provided contact information, and again, I'm reachable at 202-343-9139. My contact information is all over the GPP website. If we don't get to your question, please let me know, and we will try to get you answers. We can email the presentations to anybody that would like them. Just send us an email. The presentations will be posted on the Second Nature website, though I don't have a posting date for that. My apologies. They will also likely be posted on the GPP website shortly. So let's dive in here, and in no particular place. Ben, while I get some of these other questions queued up, one of the questions that came in several different configurations was, okay, I'm in a market where third-party PPAs are either expressly forbidden or there's some uncertainty. What do I do?
Right, that's a great question, Blaine. In fact, I was just describing that situation to some folks yesterday. There's a number of innovations that are happening. So if you take the current status as the status quo as the only option in the foreseeable future, there's certain markets like that. Virginia is one of them, and others. There's 37 states, I believe, or actually 42 now, that have EPAs are legal in some form or fashion, and the remainder aren't. So what has been happening in those other markets are there are other structures. The lease structure is one that can work. There's two flavors of a lease, so to speak. One is a straight equipment lease, where you might find it from a bank or another financing partner that you can line up on your own, which would be just like you might lease a bus or a car or some other office equipment in the days that that was popular, like a copy machine or a printer or something. So you could lease it just like straight equipment over a period of maybe 5 to 10 years. Economics will be a little bit tight during the lease period, of course, but then afterwards it has the same characteristics of a purchase. But there are also some innovations from the PPA providers who are trying to adapt to that market. And in certain markets, they might call it other things. They might call it a solar service agreement or a solar lease. Either of those two are ones where it has many of the characteristics of a power purchase agreement, and it may also include performance guarantees and O&M in the price, but it's one that's basically contracted in a way that's legal within your state or within your area. So again, the terms and conditions and the way that it works is slightly different just because of the legal requirements in a certain state or a certain jurisdiction. But don't give up. There's certainly options out there, and if you talk to your providers about other options for your state, they do exist out there. You just need to find the right provider.
And actually, this is Blaine. We had Pete Cadens, who's the president of a company called SoCore Energy, present on our October or November GPP webinar about some anticipated pricing trends in the U.S. PV market and some financing options. SoCore really likes the leasing model and what it can do for the financial equations. That presentation is archived on our website under Events and Webinars, under the Past Webinars button. I would commend folks' attention to that. Another sort of high-level question here. accounting implications, balance sheet implications? What does a CFO need to know here for a university contemplating a PPA?
Would you like, this is Ben, would you like me to take it? Or
I think that's right in your wheelhouse, yep.
Yeah, sure. So what we found is that I'll take the power purchase agreement as an example. Because it's a straight energy purchase, just like you would purchase from your prevailing utility, whoever that may be, you don't have to capitalize that, right? That's not on your balance sheet because your agreement, although it's a long-term expectation, you don't have to capitalize that up front. So we do find that a benefit from a pure financial CFO perspective is one that the power purchase agreement is not on your balance sheet. And so therefore, you don't have to bear the costs of that from a capital perspective or from tying up funds in your balance sheet. There generally is a recognition of the long-term nature of that contract from a disclosure perspective on your financial statements, although none of the organizations here probably have any public requirements for that. But the reality is that the power purchase agreement is not on your balance sheet. Now, as I mentioned earlier, sometimes there are capital funds that can be used, and those can be used to generate operational savings through a direct purchase. So there are times when, especially in the municipal sector, where they may choose to use those funds for a solar project out of the capital budget and then see the long-term savings directly into the operational side of the general fund. So those are a couple of concerns to look at. Okay.
Chris, we have a question for you, which is, this is a great question. WGES and Standard Solar have maintenance responsibility for the system. So operationally, do they have access to your roof? Do they have to call you? What's the arrangement there?
Yeah, they have to give us notice. I would have to look in the contract, but it specifies how much notice they need to give us, and we need to be reasonable in giving them access. And that is a good question, because already, even in the first year and a half of having the panels on our roofs, we have had to access them a couple times. One of the things I would encourage people to consider when they're doing this is try to look forward a little bit to any other needs you might have for equipment on your roofs. We've got a couple of buildings that we did this on have food retail in them, and as tenants have turned over, our needs for HVAC on the roof have changed. So we have had to move a couple already in order to make space for running conduit to and putting new equipment on the roof to serve those retail spaces. So, if you can, try to look forward a little bit, because there is a cost just to move the panels out of the way for something else.
Now, presumably, you're actually getting some ancillary benefit there from having gone with a ballasted rack system rather than a penetration-based system, right? Actually moving those panels, while not anybody's first choice, is actually a relatively manageable deal.
Yep, that's right.
Yep.
The one thing is the system we use comes in strings of, I think, 13 panels. So that's another thing to think about, is that if you need to move one, you need to move 13. So just something to know, not a reason that would have really changed anything we did, but it does mean that if you're off by a few inches for something, it may mean a whole string of 13 needs to move, and that may be different for other for panels from different manufacturers.
Okay. And we've had a couple of questions about site feasibility and so how that process works. And so that everybody knows, one of the things that we've been working with Optony here in DC on is conducting detailed site feasibility studies across the DC region for a set of stakeholders. And so, Chris, you queued up the notion of satellite views as a good first pass. Presumably, you were looking at rooftops that weren't scheduled for replacement in the next 5 or 10 years, right? Because you're going to stack a whole bunch of hardware on them. You guys each want to address what other issues might be involved in site studies and how how a school might approach getting at least an initial sense of what their opportunity might be?
Yeah, I will mention one other thing on that, which is that the build, there's only so much roof space, and the need for energy is much greater than the amount of roof space we have in terms of the productive capacity of solar PV. So we did make a choice that on our residence halls, which on our campus happen to be much taller than the rest of our buildings. The rest of the buildings are a few stories. The residence halls are 8 or 10 stories. And because of their height, the wind uplift with solar PV panels is more of an issue. So ballasting, basically you need more weight to hold the panels down. And so that's a trade-off that we made, was to say, well, actually, we use a lot more hot water in the residence halls. So in the residence halls, instead of going with PV, we went with solar thermal, and we used tubes. So we used the technology that provided the type of energy we needed more in that building, and the type of technology that we used also itself helped address the wind issue, because tubes allow wind to pass through them. So we addressed the weight issue and chose a more appropriate technology for the type of energy that's used in those buildings. So in short, we used solar PV on short buildings and short academic or administrative buildings, and we used solar hot water on tall residence halls.
Mm-hmm. Ben, you want to? That's very helpful. Ben, you want to add anything there?
Sure. And Chris has got some great experiences that he's sharing with everyone, having been through the process now a number of times with different technologies. So I think from our perspective, just to add to that a bit, is there's two levels of feasibility that we like to look at. One is the technical piece, which is what Chris was describing. Is the roof capable? Is it sized appropriately? Can you get the expected technology that you're looking for on the roof, and does it make sense for that facility? And how do you do that? And what are incremental costs you might have to incur to actually install it? And then the other piece is economics. So let's say you do find a solution that makes sense, but then maybe on your particular facility, either the energy usage, the costs are different than what you expect, or let's say it's trying to heat a pool versus residential hot water, the residence halls hot water, then that can change the tax nature and some of the incentives that are available to the system. Or on PV, what are the SREC valuation, and does it make economic sense? So there's an initial screen that you can do even on your own. If you look at the IMBY, it's called In My Backyard tool that the DOE has put out, that you can actually do some fairly basic sizing on your own, just looking at basically a Google map and mapping it out to see roughly what's the size of the system and get some initial estimates just to get the ball rolling. And then the feasibility study on a more technical basis, working with your facility staff and doing a full analysis on the technical side of the economics. So the technical is, can you do it? And the economic is, should you do it, so to speak? And those are all important considerations.
Okay. Okay, that's great. We've had a series of questions. Chris, your discussion of the SREC valuation here in DC triggered a series of questions, and we've had several folks ask, where do I find the SREC value in my market, right? How do I understand that piece of it? And Chris, you said it. Well, actually, I'm not sure you said this. I'm presuming that it was the developer team that came and said, all right, well, so here, Chris, one of the things you want to consider is that the SRECs will have a value of $326 because this is the DC market, and we are here to provide that piece of information to you.
There's, in DC and throughout the Mid-Atlantic, there's an online exchange. So you can look at prices. You can look at what SRECs are trading for almost instantaneously on a website called FLET, that's F-L-E-T-T, exchange.com. So I just went to the website right now. You don't have to have an account or anything. You just go to fletexchange.com, click on your state, and it tells you what SRECs are trading for. Very transparent.
Nicely done. Ben, anything to add there?
Yeah, there are a number of resources like that are available at SREC Trade as well. So there's what's the current value, and then if you're looking more from a policy perspective or broad perspective, you go to the Desire database, DSIRE.org, and look for the what's going on state by state. So they have maps in terms of where there are renewable portfolio standards and enforcement of the those from a REC perspective or an SREC market. So there's some, if you're looking sort of forward, broadly speaking, is there a market that exists in your state from a national perspective? And then the example, the flood exchange that Chris gave is a great one, just to see like what's the actual pricing. And I think not only your developer will have some insight, but there are also SREC brokers that exist in the space to help facilitate and maximize the value of those as well. So there are a number of parties that will help you.
And that website that Ben just mentioned is a gold mine, and it's also listed on one of the slides that I used, I think slide 7, the one where I had the financing options. So if you download these slides after the webinar, you've got the website on there.
And on a related note, somebody from Ohio observed that they had a REC market there, and she may have been an SREC market, but the market itself was in her words, decimated. And I know looking around at some other REC markets in the U.S., and particularly looking at markets with a DG carve-out, one of the things that we've seen in a couple of places is that the pent-up demand for solar, to do solar and to access that series of benefits is considerable in a lot of places. And we've seen markets where the DG carve-out very quickly fills to capacity because there is so much good technical opportunity in that market and actually enough stakeholders that want to move projects forward. And so I know in D.C. the DG carve-out has been increased at least once. There's talk of increasing it again because there's actually quite a slug of demand here. Ben, you spend a lot of time looking at the national range of markets. You have thoughts on that?
Well, first off, your observation, Blaine, is spot on. That there is just a huge pent-up interest in solar, and as soon as that needle moves, the tipping point is to the point where the economics work for the bulk of those systems that have, or the bulk of those facilities or locations that have technical potential. It just goes, like wildfire in terms of the growth of the the industry. And so where you see a strong SREC market, it doesn't take long at all for the supply side, for the folks that want to do solar at a certain price point to jump in and do it. So it's interesting to see. This is more a policymakers discussion, I guess, on that point, but that by just, you can move it just far enough to where you make the economics work on those sites that you can really have a market take off. Having said that, though, it is kind of interesting to work in different markets where, take in New Jersey, for instance, where it was at one point close to $600 per REC, so that's about 50 cents per kilowatt hour. Which is a huge subsidy, right, potential. And then you go to other markets, like let's say California, where there's no value to it at all yet, and yet projects are getting done. So what we like to see from a buyer's perspective or a PPA perspective is, or even a direct purchase, no matter how you're going to do it, is to basically separate that out. So when you're trying to look at the project economics, look at it without the SRECs first, to see how close you are to a good economic equation, and then layer in the SRECs in a way that gets you to the point that you're comfortable economically with a transaction, which may be a very low valuation or may have to be a high valuation, depending on the situation. And then you'll know incrementally what the SREC value needs to be and where you're sort of in the money, so to speak, on that, so that you can maintain your risk. So just one more example of that is that right now most of the SRECs are being traded in 3-year blocks at most, and because of some of the future uncertainty. So if you were to, for instance, give away or sell all of your SRECs for 15 years, for instance, at the only the value that you can capture in the next 3, and you've got sort of 12 years worth of SREC marketing claims or green claims or value that essentially sort of being transferred for free. And so you'd want to make sure that you understand what, not only what the economics of the project looks like without the SRECs, but then also when you layer them in, make sure that you're capturing as a buyer as much of that value as possible, at least retaining the value on the out years, where maybe the PPA provider or the financier isn't willing to give you a price break on that out year SREC value, but in which case then you may as well just own it.
I'm glad you said that, Ben. We actually have seen a couple of higher education partners doing PPAs that have monetized the SRECs long enough for a long enough period to make the deal go, right? Mm-hmm. Maybe for 7 years or for 10 years on a 20-year PPA, and then they get the RECs in the out years, right? So the financier is happy because they've got the revenue they need to make the project go, and then especially for a school that's looking at getting to climate neutrality, for those years when the SRECs are being monetized, their emissions remain constant. As soon as they start getting them in year 7 or year 11 or year 16, whenever it is, their emissions take a big drop, right? And so they can build in that anticipated emissions performance on the back end of the deal and still make the project go. It's been it was very clever when someone thought of that.
Great.
So I want to be respectful of everybody's time. I appreciate everyone hanging in. This has been great. We've covered most of the major questions. What we haven't necessarily talked too much about is we haven't talked about the tax credits and the future there and sort of long-term price trends. And so maybe, Ben, that would be a great thing to close on. I mean, there is the PTC uncertainty,
right?
And because of your work, you've got probably a pretty good national perspective on pricing trends. You want to offer a couple of closing thoughts?
Sure, love to. First on the ITC, investment tax credit and accelerated depreciation benefits for solar and other renewable projects. That's scheduled to end in 2016 or at the end of 2016. And so, however, having said that, the Commission talks, fiscal cliff, et cetera, that Blaine and the folks in D.C. I'm sure have a much better handle on, or at least insight into what's going to happen there. But while it's in law right now through the end of 2016, it is certainly I don't think it's 100% safe from being cut. Now, there hasn't been any direct discussions on that, but it's something certainly we're trying to watch very carefully. And so, having said that, by 2016, then the ITC reverts back from 30% to 10%. It doesn't go away entirely. It's always been 10% unless they take some other really draconian measures to investment tax credits. Then basically it's a 20% number that would not be subsidized anymore on a commercial transaction. I think as Chris had mentioned, the project developer that you would be engaged with takes, or their financier that can take advantage of the tax credit, they retain some of that benefit on their own. So you don't actually see all, the additional 30% that comes from the investment tax credit in your cost savings, because they have to make a return on their investment and their equity as well. So having said that, though, the market continues to decrease in prices pretty dramatically. I mean, on the commercial sector, we're seeing prices on a national scope going down from maybe $6 a watt installed 2 or 3 years ago to $4 a watt maybe a year ago, and then into the $3 a watt range this year. So we continue to see very dramatic price drops on the gross installed cost. Now, there's a lot of variables that go into it in terms of the site and the technology and the contracting process and the technology requirements and those things. But we're just seeing a continued drop in the gross installed cost, and that's before any rebates, any SREC pricing, and those things. And put in perspective, the Department of Energy is targeting somewhere below $2 a watt in total installed cost by the 2016 to 2020 range, because they're trying to adapt to the fact that there are fewer and fewer incentives and subsidies that are either required or are available. So we continue to see the price points go down, and that's largely the market dynamics, the increase in competition, the scale of the entire system. And if you compare it to, let's say, a German market, which is #1 market in terms of total installed solar capacity, even though its solar potential is equivalent to about Alaska, roughly, then we see that their prices are sub $3 a watt, largely because of the scale and other factors that are involved in terms of the ease or lack of complexity of getting these projects done on the ground. So the target that we're all going for is, I think, is well within reach. And as the costs continue to come down, that's where we see more and more economically viable projects happening around the country. So, but what that's doing is that is in a very, very positive way covering for the decrease in whether it's the SREC values in markets that they exist or in the tax benefits that are scheduled to roll off in another 3 or 4 years. So doesn't mean that you wait until the prices go down that far, because there are timing benefits. I think, as Blaine was just mentioning, with the SREC market in D.C., that can expire, or it can be filled up with the through-to-generation allocation for SREC can be very easily met, in which case then the incentives that were available are no longer available. So it's all good news. It's all moving in the right direction.
Chris, do you have a closing thought from AU's perspective?
No, it's like you guys both said. It's a good thing to do. It works, and we did it, and that's proof.
Nice.
And by the way, our goal, I should, I've been talking about what we've done on campus at AU, but Washington, D.C. as a whole has a very proud sustainability higher ed sector, and we have staked our flag in the ground, and we are striving to be what we believe will be the greenest college town in America, and this is just part of that effort. So look for more from us soon.
Nice. Gentlemen, thank you both very much. Everyone, thank you all for attending the session today. I'm sorry that I know we have a couple of questions we didn't quite get to. We have captured them, and I would be glad to have a conversation with anybody on the session about questions we didn't answer or to provide more clarification. When you leave the session, you will get a little pop-up feedback form. Please, our end game is helping you all do this and have the same kind of success on your campus that AU has achieved on theirs. So let us know, and let's keep talking, and we're looking for some leaders, and it's game on time. Happy holidays. Call us, email us. Thanks again, and hope to engage with you very shortly. And that brings the webinar to a close. We're going to turn it off and have a good rest of the day, everybody.